Hello again. Now, despite my promise of a fishing video this time around, the keen-eyed amongst you might have noticed that I'm in fact not on the boat. I'm really sorry about that. The persistent east wind that we had earlier in the season has given way to persistent south-westerlies. It's been rough all week. The week before it was good, Monday to Thursday. I had to work. By the time the weekend came around it was awful. This week it's been rough. Today it has dropped off a little bit, but just the residual waves from the south-westerlies we've had all week mean that it's too rough out there. I did get up at 5 this morning, check the weather, check the webcams, excuse me, check the webcams. There's a couple on the coast. Looked at the trees. I can see from my house they're all starting to flutter and the leaves turn inside out, so it was going to be a non-starter. So I thought I'd bring you something else today. Now my sorry, I'm still trying to get rid of this cough, so excuse me sucking a sweet while I'm talking. My last video on life jackets, from that it became quite obvious that there's quite a lot of people that are new to getting into boating, getting into fishing, which is brilliant. Fully support that, absolutely fully support that. So I thought I'd put something on. Brilliant. You don't get this at sea. Excuse all the background noise. Yeah, so a lot of people have asked me about tides, and if you're new to fairly new to boating, obviously you need an appreciation of the tides, but how that affects your fishing is not quite so obvious maybe. So I thought I'd have a little chat about that, mainly because lots of people ask me where to fish. Can't give marks away. Lots of people ask how to fish, but just as importantly is when to fish, and that can be crucial, either to your fishing or what type of fishing you're going to do. So let's have a little look at a tidal chart. Right. Here's one I prepared earlier, roughly based on today's tides. So if we've got midnight, 6, noon, 1800, and then back to midnight again. If it was a spring tide, we'd have the red line with higher high tides and lower low tides, 2 in a day. If it was neap tides, then that curve is smoothed out a bit. So the tides still occur at the same time, but they're just not as big. Also, because the neap tides are not as big, the spring tides are moving more water, the steepness of these sides sort of represents the speed of the flow. So here we've got virtually just a light flow all day in and out. Here we've got low water slack, where it's not moving at all. It goes from going out to coming in. Then we've got the speed picking up, a fast period, the speed slowing down, high water slack, where the tide stops from coming in to going out, and then the same again. We've got a picking up period, a fast period, a slack period, and so it goes on. So that is roughly a tidal day. The times are going to vary throughout the monthly cycle, but that's roughly a tidal day. 2 high waters, 2 low waters. Neap tides, you've got a very slow flow in and out. Spring tides, you've got a fast flow in and out. You have slack water at the bottom of each tide and a slack water period at the top of each tide. In reality, we've got somewhere between the two. Obviously we've got neaps on full neaps, we've got springs on full springs, but for most of the month it's either heading towards neaps or it's heading towards springs. So how does that affect us as fishermen and women? Now I'm going to speak in very general terms, and this is for offshore fishing. If you're fishing up against the coast, some very local effects take place, and for very close inshore work there's no substitute for local knowledge. So you can gain that. You can also cheat a little bit. I'm not suggesting that you find the nearest commercial rod and line fishermen and follow them around. That would be rude. However, what I do, here's a little cheat, if I'm fishing inshore, I happen to know one particularly excellent rod and line commercial bass fisherman, but he's got a slow boat. It's a diesel inboard, and if I see him heading in one direction, I've got a rough idea where he's going. My boat's faster, so I nip out ahead of him, and then he joins my drift, which isn't rude and I don't mind. Yeah, but I've seen him pull in a 4 or 5 pound bass and then move. Well, if I catch a fish that size, I'm going to be there for the rest of the day. But with his local knowledge, he knows that either somewhere else is about to become more productive, or the tide and the conditions have just finished at that spot and he's leaving, he's going somewhere else. But that is a lifetime of fishing in this area and picking up that knowledge. So I'm not talking about the coastal stuff. What I'm talking about is going out, and it's going to be different for different areas, how far out you have to go, but principally talking about wreck or reef fishing. Wreck fishing is obvious, we're fishing over a wreck. Reef fishing is just a general term for fishing over any patch of roughish ground. It might be pinnacles, there might be valleys over there, you know, just any sort of roughish ground is sort of termed reef fishing. Now, this is very general. There are lots of other things to take into consideration, and there might be very local issues. But for example, after we've had a blow, if it calms down after a southwesterly blow, it can be very good fishing. It's all had a bit of a stir up. The bottom of the food chain's got stirred up a little bit, and that can have an effect. If we've had east wind, it can be notoriously difficult to, even on the best tides, to fish in an east wind. If the wind is with the tide or against the tide, that's going to make a difference. So I'm not going into the nuances of it all. That's far too much. This is just very, very general. So, broadly speaking, on the neap tide days, you've not got a massive flow of water. That is ideal for wreck fishing with bait. On the steeper sections of the spring tides, where there's a lot of movement in the water, that gets the fish buzzing, and that is ideal for lure fishing on reefs. At the slack water periods, that can be quite good for bait, catching bait, and also back on the wrecks for bait fishing. Neap tides is really an extension of slack tides. On full neaps, it's really an extension of slack tides. So that's the period when it can be good for wreck fishing with bait. Like I say, these are very, very general terms. I've caught some extremely good fish on the most unlikely tides, and I've had very poor days on the most likely tides. But what you can do is increase your chances if you're using the right methods on the right days and fishing in the right areas on the right days. So I'll give you an example of how it applies to me. So you will have heard me talk about single tide and two tide days. This, hopefully you can see it, this pencil line is my sort of getting out line, if you like. That's when I can get off my mooring. So on today's tide, which is about 9 o'clock, I can get off the mooring at 6. I could get back at 12, but I'll give myself half an hour's grace and get back about 11:30. So, with the aid of a cut down business card, on today's tide, that's my getting out, fishing time, and coming back. So if we apply that to the tide, it would appear that I go out, and if I'm on a neat tide, I've got ideal tides for fishing on a wreck. If I'm on a spring tide, I've got a bit of the fast movement for lure fishing, and then I've got the slack tide. So that would appear that it's good for wreck fishing. I don't do a lot of wreck fishing, so why is that? Most of my fishing is on reefs, and the reason for that is that the tides offshore are not the same as the tides at the port. I think every coast is the same. they're, for the distance I go out, they're about 3 hours behind. Out to sea always lags the tide inshore. So what I'm going to do with my little card here, instead of redrawing the map 3 hours that way, I'm going to move this 3 hours that way. So this is what I end up fishing. So when I get out there, by the time I've got out, if it's on the neap tides, then yes, you can go wreck fishing anytime, because you can wreck fish a neap tide anytime. That's if it's small enough. Remember I said that most of the time it's somewhere in between. For me, once it's above a knot, it's tricky on a wreck. A knot and a half, I'll give up. You just lose. It's not to say the fish are there, and it's not to say they're not feeding. It's just it's too difficult. It's too difficult to fish the wreck. You either got really heavy leads, your line's at too much of an angle. If your line's at too much of an angle, you're either not in contact with the bottom, so you're not going to catch a fish, or you're dragging it through too much of the structure that you're just going to lose too much gear. So quite often, unless you're on the slackest of neap tides, wreck fishing is not an option. So come back to the spring tides, and yeah, by the time we get out there, we're on a fairly good bit of the tide for lure fishing on the reefs. It depends on the speed and how close to springs we are, but for this period, that is the good bit for lure fishing on the reefs. And I miss the slack water high completely, because the tide is 3 hours later out to sea. Final point, that's my getting out window on a single tide. So that's the one tide day. So for a two tide day, I can go out any time between 6 and 12, and then I can't get back on the mooring for all of this, and then I can get back in about 7 in the evening, and any time from 7 in the evening till midnight on today's tide. So the two tide days in the summer, not too bad. I can come back at 7 o'clock in the evening. In the winter it's dark, so I won't do that. So it's why I do get quite excited about two tide days. They are, the way the daylight hours fall and whatever, it's generally a spring tide. I can fish for longer, but crucially I get to fish the high flow bit of the tide going down. I get to fish slack water, which I don't often get to fish on. I never get to fish on a single tide out to sea, and I get to fish as much of the rising tide as I like before I come back in, limited by daylight or whatever. So that's sort of it in a nutshell. I hope you managed to follow that. So just in summary, and there's no hard and fast rules, there's no switch. You can't say on this tide at this time I'll go out and catch a bass or a ling or whatever, but you can improve your chances. Generally speaking, if you've got slacker water, it's when the ambush predators, ling, conger, are going to want to come out and catch an easy bait, a struggling, dying fish. So they'll catch on your baits. And generally speaking, when the water's faster, that's when your aggressive predatory fish are going to come after something that appears to be swimming, bass, pollock, after your lures, etc. No hard and fast rules. That's why they call it fishing and not catching, as the old saying goes. But if you can apply a little bit of that to your area, and the key thing to remember is what it says in the tide table for your port is not necessarily what's going on where you're fishing. But you'll feel that, you'll feel when slack water is, and then you'll be able to adjust your fishing methods appropriately. I hope you enjoyed that. I will strive to bring you a fishing video next time. Thanks for watching.